faithfully delivering value and interpreting great books worldwide. Hi, this is Sally Talks Books. Today, I'll interpret the book Antarctica for you, a history of Antarctic exploration, discovery, and territorial disputes. When mentioning Antarctica, many first imagine adorable penguins, serene ice landscapes, humanity's last pristine wilderness. But you might not know Antarctica holds incredibly abundant and vital resources. 80% of Earth's fresh water is frozen in Antarctic ice sheets. Eastern Antarctica's iron ore could supply global needs for 200 years. Moreover, Antarctic ice preserves countless meteorites and ice cores containing climate records spanning millennia. Truly, Antarctica is Earth's unparalleled natural laboratory for environmental history. Precisely due to this significance, Antarctica has been fiercely contested by world powers for over 2 centuries. Since the 18th century, explorers sailed through treacherous sea ice to reach the continent. They raced across ice and snow to plant national flags, some paying the ultimate price. Governments employed extreme measures to claim sovereignty, even sending pregnant women to give birth there. The author is Australian historian David Day, born 1949, specializing in Australian and World War II history, winner of South Australia's Nonfiction Literary Award. So why write about Antarctica? Firstly, Australia's proximity makes Antarctica integral to its history. Secondly, David uncovered d'Urville's story during research. D'Urville, a 19th century French explorer, first landed on Adelie Land, home of Adelie penguins. When raising France's flag to claim territory, only penguins witnessed it. How could this self-proclaimed ritual justify French colonization? Who truly owns Antarctica? To answer this, David's book comprehensively presents Antarctica's 200-year history for the first time. So, now I'll explore the book's content through 3 key sections. First, how was Antarctica discovered? What kind of competition did explorers launch for this? Second, who actually owns Antarctica? Third, how has humanity changed Antarctica? Let's start with part 1, how Antarctica was discovered. Actually, many geographical discoveries began with errors. Take Columbus. He sailed west seeking Asia, but reached America instead, thinking it was India. Antarctica's discovery also started with mistaken guidance. Since ancient Greece, legends spoke of Terra Australis, a vast southern continent mirroring Eurasia, rich in resources. By late 1700s, after conquering Americas, Africa, and Australia, Westerners targeted this southern land. They sailed through roaring westerlies. Enter Antarctic exploration's first pioneer, Captain Cook. Cook, famed British explorer, discovered New Zealand and Australia's eastern coast. January 1773, Antarctic summer peak. Commissioned by Royal Navy, Cook led 2 ships seeking the mythical southern continent. Evading massive icebergs, they crossed Antarctic Circle, first explorers to do so. Tragically, Cook didn't realize he was just 120 kilometers from Antarctica. Had he sailed east, he'd have spotted Antarctic coastline. But sea ice and thick fog forced his retreat. Yet this voyage disproved Terra Australis. No temperate supercontinent existed. Cook concluded any undiscovered southern land must be polar, iceberg-choked, frozen, hostile, unworthy of British investment. But explorers soon proved Cook wrong. In 1812, rising Russia defeated Napoleon. Tsar Alexander I challenged Britain and France. 7 years later, he launched an Antarctic expedition to showcase Russian naval power. The Tsar ordered, unless facing insurmountable barriers, push south, find unknown lands near the pole, meaning Russia's expedition had to surpass Cook's achievements. 40-year-old Bellingshausen was appointed expedition leader. January 1820, 47 years after Cook crossed Antarctic Circle, Bellingshausen also sailed into it. One day, he spotted Antarctic ice shells, one of discovery history's pivotal moments. Yet Bellingshausen didn't realize he was making history, unknowingly recording immortal words. He wrote of endless solid ice and snow-capped mountains, Later, his coordinates proved he'd seen Antarctic Peninsula, Antarctica's largest peninsula, like a welcoming arm stretching northward. Blinded by heavy snow, he didn't realize he'd fulfilled the Tsar's mission. Becoming Antarctica's first discoverer, tragically, poor English translations delayed recognition for 130 plus years. Meanwhile, seal poachers grew active near Antarctica. Early 1800s, one U.S. ship could harvest 9,000 seal skins in 15 days, a colossal fortune. Soft pelts became leather goods, blubber rendered into oil. Hunters swarmed like sharks smelling blood, driving seals to near extinction. Sealskin wealth myths fueled global competition for Antarctic resources. Thus began Antarctica's great age of discovery. Over a century, explorers pieced together Antarctica's map like a jigsaw, but the South Pole remained a final missing piece. As exploration advanced, assaults on the pole began. 1912 became Antarctic exploration's pivotal year. Two explorers launched a globally watched race to be first at the pole. One is Britain's Scott, the other is Norway's Amundsen. How hard is it to reach the South Pole? To put it this way, Antarctica's total area is about 14 million square kilometers, equivalent to 1.5 times the size of China, and it's almost entirely covered in ice and snow. From the moment you land, there's no food supply to be found, and you have to endure temperatures as low as minus 50 to 60 degrees Celsius, plus storms exceeding force 12. Moreover, the South Pole sits on the Antarctic Plateau at over 3,500 meters above sea level. And in the final push, you have to overcome altitude sickness. And you have to overcome altitude sickness. Even today, the South Pole remains one of the hardest places to reach on Earth. Currently, Antarctic tourism with adventure mainly involves cruise ships for sightseeing in surrounding seas and islands. To reach the South Pole, you can only fly, costing about 600,000 RMB per person. Let's get back to these two men competing for the South Pole. British explorer Scott was a naval elite. He joined the Royal Navy at 13 and by 32 had set a record by reaching 82 degrees south in Antarctica. His rival, Norwegian Amundsen, was a genius explorer with a pirate-like spirit. At 21, he embarked on seafaring, and before racing for the South Pole, he was already the first to traverse the Northwest Passage in the Arctic. Amundsen also joined a Belgian Antarctic expedition in 1897 as first mate. Because their ship got stuck in pack ice, the crew was stranded at sea for 13 months. To combat scurvy, they survived by eating fresh penguin meat to get vitamin C, making them the first expedition to overwinter within the Antarctic Circle. This experience gave Amundsen ample Antarctic survival skills. To prepare thoroughly and surprise his rival, Amundsen pretended to head to the Arctic for scientific research, even borrowed instruments from Scott, faking that the two expeditions could coordinate simultaneous observations at opposite ends of the Earth. Amundsen departed over a month before Scott arrived in Melbourne. Only then did Scott learn that Amundsen's expedition ship had already sailed for Antarctica. But Scott wasn't completely at a disadvantage because he had the full backing of the British Empire, with the UK government alone investing £20,000. But no one could have imagined that the high-quality equipment Scott specially commissioned became a stumbling block in Antarctica. Let's talk about Scott's proud 3 snowmobiles. They were super fancy gear back then, hauling tons of supplies. But when moving them from ship to ice, thin ice cracked, one snowmobile sank, the other 2 flopped in soft snow, ditched after just 80 kilometers. Besides snowmobiles, Scott brought 8 ponies for sled pulling, but they weren't cut out for Antarctica and got wiped out fast. Scott and his 4 mates ended up hauling sledges themselves. This backbreaking man-hauling left him totally worn out. In January 1912, Scott's team reached what they thought was the South Pole, only to see Amundsen's tent. He knew he'd lost. to the Norwegians. But in despair and fear, he built a snow cone, raised the British flag, and headed back. Scurvy, frostbite, and hunger took the explorers down one by one. Scott realized he couldn't make it back to the ship. So he talked his pals into staying put in the tent, waiting for the end, instead of pushing on. Dying on the trail meant the tent could shield their bodies and records, making it easier to find later. Meanwhile, Amundsen's crew, funded by loans, had a crazy smooth trip. This Norwegian, a ski pro since he was a kid, traveled light with skis and sled dogs. The tools Scott dismissed turned out super practical on ice. But bad measurements meant both thought they'd hit the South Pole when they weren't at the real one. So, off by 1 to 2 kilometers. He won, but didn't win folks over. When he telegraphed his South Pole success, people were more worried about his rival. Is Scott still alive? Where is he? When Scott's death news and letters spread worldwide, Amundsen's glory got buried by tragedy. This was on the eve of World War I. From Captain Cook to Scott, over a century, Brits led Antarctic exploration because they had more explorers, claimed the most land, and backed by the world's strongest navy. But the two world wars that followed reshaped Antarctic competition, with Americans rising to dominance. This was because America led in high tech. Their expeditions pioneered motorized transport and radio communication. Most crucially, the first to fly over the South Pole was American Richard Byrd. A Naval Academy graduate, he'd flown over the North Pole in 1926. On November 28, 1929 evening, Byrd and crew took off from Antarctic Base, reaching South Pole airspace shortly after midnight. Byrd opened the cabin floor hatch and dropped a small American flag, humanity's first flight over the pole. Never before seen lands unfolded before Byrd at 160 kilometers per hour. This was unimaginable to Scott just 17 years prior. Byrd's plane carried 2 photographers, one from Paramount Pictures filming a documentary for theaters, the other handled aerial survey photography. Henceforth, ordinary people could sip coffee at home while seeing Antarctic aerial photos in newspapers. Images of snow-capped peaks, crevasses, and glaciers made humanity feel Antarctica was conquered, no longer mysterious. Yet, from Cook onward, Antarctic exploration was never pure. Heroism masked nations scrambling for territory. For example, East Antarctica's Queen Maud Land, larger than 10 Jiangsu, Zhejiang, Shanghai regions combined, named by Amundsen after Norway's Queen Maud, to claim that vast land. Similarly, Byrd dropping the American flag was blatant territorial assertion, which begs the question, who owns Antarctica? The 1959 Antarctic Treaty declared it belongs to no one. Today's tourists need no visas thanks to this treaty. But before that, what justified nations claiming chunks of Antarctica? No laws or principles ever governed such questions. Countries argue endlessly based on their own interpretations of possession. For over 2 centuries, nations have fought countless verbal battles. For the book, territorial claims rely on 4 arguments. First, who discovered it first owns it. Second, performing possession rituals like flag planting, oath reading, or naming grants ownership. Third, possessing detailed survey data and geographical knowledge. Fourth, building bases with long-term occupation for de facto control. The most powerful nation at the time decides which argument counts. Britain pushed discoverers' rights since their explorers found most early territories. But first discovery is often disputed. Nations twist logic to justify their claims. Americans argued seal hunter Nathaniel Palmer first spotted Antarctic Peninsula. Thus, America should own that land. Hard to convince others that killing wildlife somewhere grants ownership. Utterly unconvincing. Palmer held no formal ceremonies like the British, nor left credible records like Bellingshausen. Which brings us to the second argument, possession rituals like flag raising or naming. Even if the audience was just penguins, like French explorer D'Urville shooing squawking penguins aside at Adelie Land in 1840, They raised France's flag on untouched land. Even D'Urville's crew found it ridiculous. By Byrd's flight era, flag dropping from planes became the new ritual. Explorers documented these sovereignty acts themselves, publishing accounts back home, giving diplomats so-called historical evidence for their arguments. Beyond possession rituals, naming mountains, islands, coastlines, or landmasses was crucial. Multiple countries naming one area happened often in Antarctica. For example, Americans long called the Antarctic Peninsula Palmer Peninsula, while Brits named it Graham Land. And the US and UK argued from the 19th to 20th century until 1964 when they compromised. Antarctic Peninsula overall with Palmer Land and Graham Land as subsections. This way, nobody lost face. That Argentina and Chile rejected this, keeping original names like Chile's O'Higgins territory. The third claim basis was vital, possessing detailed survey data and geographical knowledge. Early on, finding land plus a small ceremony meant claiming it for your nation. But by the 20th century, scientific research became mandatory for claims. After all, you can't claim territory just from lucky discovery or flag raising. You must understand its geography. Knowledge meant power. Only with better maps and intel than rivals could you confidently assert sovereignty. Richard Byrd, first to fly over the pole, mastered this tactic. He always raised funds for science with strong backing from President Roosevelt. And supported by the National Geographic Society, Byrd photographed and measured vast Antarctic territories, revealing the unknown continent. That others caught on, Norwegians and Australians soon joined this research competition. One Australian captain bluntly admitted, "Scientific research? Nonsense. We're here to grab land." Still, these land grab expeditions had one benefit, drastically improving Antarctic map accuracy. Unlike early sailors sketching from distant decks, combining aerial photography with ground surveys finally mapped Antarctica properly. Thus, the distance between humanity and Antarctica was greatly shortened. Finally, let's discuss the fourth basis, actual occupation. With 2 world wars driving military and technological breakthroughs, the threshold for Antarctic occupation gradually increased. As previously mentioned, the most powerful nation dictated the rules for Antarctic occupation. Unlike Britain's first discovery equals ownership stance, the ascendant U.S. claimed actual occupation was what mattered. This was because after 2 world wars, Britain's navy lost its global dominance and couldn't effectively reach Antarctica. The U.S. and other nations seized the opportunity to build bases, post offices, and other facilities in Antarctica. In 1939, U.S. President Roosevelt even planned to colonize Antarctica, but the Pacific War outbreak scrapped the plan. However, nations employed all means, even absurd theatrics, to demonstrate territorial occupation. In 1953, Argentina's navy shipped 10 tons of soil to a small island, supposedly for farming. In reality, the soil symbolized the island as inseparable Argentine territory. In 1978, Argentina escalated by flying a heavily pregnant commander's wife to give birth in Antarctica. This infant became the first person born on the Antarctic continent. 6 years later, Chile copied this by having a baby born on King George Island to strengthen their claim. Moreover, Chile built schools, gyms, and supermarkets on the island. Later, Russians constructed an Orthodox church there. Beyond Britain and the US, Australia, Norway, Argentina, Sweden, and even Germany attempted Antarctic dominance. Japan also strived on this political stage to secure territorial rights. Post-WW1, the Soviet Union joined the race, building research stations and altering territorial divisions. While uniting against the Soviet Union, the US and its Western allies also schemed against each other internally. After countless tough negotiations, 12 nations signed the Antarctic Treaty in 1959, freezing territorial claims a model for peaceful dispute resolution. These 12 nations include the UK, US, France, Australia, New Zealand, Norway, Argentina, Chile, Belgium, South Africa, USSR, and Japan. The Antarctic Treaty's core principles: frozen sovereignty, peaceful use, and scientific cooperation. Though territorial disputes officially ended, covert rivalries never ceased. Research stations became crucial pawns for territorial claims. Building stations serves two purposes. First, obvious scientific observation and research. Don't forget, knowledge equals power, as I analyzed earlier. Only by knowing more Antarctic science than others can you confidently participate in governance. Second, if the treaty ever ends, stations serve as physical sovereignty claims. Study station maps, it's like chess. Locations maximize strategic advantage within existing power structures. After 200 plus years of conflict, let's discuss humanity's impact on Antarctica. What happened to the true natives who lived there millennia before humans? Though Cook missed the continent, he doomed Antarctic wildlife. December 1774, Cook reached Isla de los Estados near Argentina, now called End of the World by tourists. There, Cook saw whale pods, bays crammed with fur seals, sea lions, penguins, and seabirds. Facing defenseless wildlife, humanity's greed and cruelty were laid bare. Who shot large sea lions for blubber oil, clubbed smaller seals, penguins, and fledgling seabirds. Fledglings were kicked aboard for dinner. Cook's published journals describing teeming Southern Ocean life drew global attention, sealing Antarctic wildlife's fate. Seals suffered first. Their valuable blubber made them easier targets than whales. These gentle creatures had lived in Antarctica for millions of years, never encountering humans. They never knew these spear-wielding intruders would bring their doom. A British explorer described carving paths through crowded penguins to hunt seal herds. Even when disturbed, the seals showed only vacant stares, clueless to their fate. He recalled, only when speared did they panic, roaring like muffled thunder. In under 30 minutes, we slaughtered 21 elephant seals plus other seals and penguins. Antarctica seals. News of abundant resources spread from New York to London, across the Pacific to Port Jackson, now Sydney, Britain's penal colony. By October 1821, London shops sold maps and charts of the South Shetlands. The South Shetlands, an archipelago 120 kilometers north of Antarctic Peninsula. Once a seal paradise, yet within a decade of human arrival, seal populations plummeted. Fur seals skinned en masse, countless elephant seals rendered into oil. The slaughter continued. After driving seals toward extinction, whales became the next target. Though a British explorer reported abundant Antarctic whales in the 1840s, whalers ignored it. Northern oceans had easier prey, and primitive whaling ships could only kill whales, then tow them to shore-based processing plants. Building Antarctic bases proved far harder than northern ones. Yet within 50 years, as Arctic whales neared extinction by early 1900s, eyes turned south. Industrial Revolution birthed steam-powered factory ships that processed whales on board. Every whale part was precious. Blubber oil for soap, candles, explosives, and heart medicine, baleen for mattresses, and corsets for European noblewomen. Post-21, refrigeration even shipped Antarctic whale meat to Japanese dinner tables. So Antarctica became a new paradise for whalers. Human slaughter pushed some whale species to near extinction. Beyond dwindling wildlife, Antarctica now faces critical environmental threats. In the 1980s, the US and New Zealand dumped waste in Antarctic waters. Americans even buried radioactive material in ice. Unlike other continents, Antarctica's ecosystem is hyperfragile. Damage often causes irreversible environmental catastrophe. Fortunately, humanity now recognizes the severity of Antarctic ecological crises. Signatories expanded the Antarctic Treaty, with pacts freezing mining, protecting environments, and fisheries. Though imperfect, the treaty system can't stop powerful nations from indirect control. Protecting Antarctic wildlife and ecosystems has become global consensus. All right, that concludes our Antarctica interpretation. Reading notes are below the audio. See you tomorrow.